Okay, bonjour, bon après-midi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. My name is Zach Paikin. I am a non-resident research fellow affiliated with the Canada in the World project at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. And thank you for joining us today for a very timely discussion after the recent Meng for Michael's exchange. We have with us four excellent panelists to discuss this complex and multifaceted topic. But before we get started, I just want to let our audience know, and it's great to see such a great turnout as well. I want to let you all know that we are about to launch, in the wake of the Meng affair, a new project at IPD called the China Strategy Project, which will be launching in the coming days, and where we will be hosting a series of different panels, and we'll be publishing a number of publications as well that will zero in on a few very specific topics concerning the future of Canada's relationship with China and how they should inform Canada's China strategy going forward. Topics to be probed include the future of Canada's universities in their relationship with China, the future of Canada-China relations as it relates to climate change, the impact of the Canada-China rivalry on multiculturalism, the business dimension as well, and of course, the broader dimension related to Canada's vision of a rules-based international order, and where and how China fits into that vision, which is something we're going to get into today as well. So please keep an eye out for that. We'll have publications coming out in the coming days, as well as panels in the weeks ahead. Back to today, however, we are not just going to be talking about the Canada-China relationship, because at its core, this Meng for Michael's exchange relates also to the US-China competition or rivalry, which has been deepening over the course of recent years. And so today we will be delving not just into the future of Canada's relationship with China, but indeed Canada's relationship with the United States, and how Canada can indeed navigate this increasingly complex international landscape that features this evolving relationship between the world's two most powerful countries. So as I mentioned before, we have four excellent panelists who are here with us today. Senator Yan Pao is joining us from Vancouver. He is a sitting senator in the Senate of Canada, as well as a fellow with UBC and SFU, and was as well the president of the Asia Pacific Foundation for nearly a decade. Senator, thank you so much for being with us. Kim Richard Nossel is joining us today from an island in the St. Lawrence River, not too far away from Kingston, Ontario. He is a professor emeritus at Queen's University in Kingston, as well as a fellow at the Center for International and Defense Policy at Queen's University. Kim, thank you so much for being with us today. Henri-Paul Normandin is joining us as well from a different island in the St. Lawrence River, situated between Montreal and Trois-Rivières. He was ambassador and deputy permanent representative to the United Nations, as well as a former counselor at the Canadian Embassy in Canada, and he is currently a fellow at the Institut d'études internationales de Montréal. Henri-Paul, merci beaucoup d'être avec nous aujourd'hui. And last but certainly not least, Amy Karam is joining us today from Ottawa. She's a fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, as well as the author of The China Factor, Leveraging Emerging Business Strategies to Compete, Grow, and Win in the New Global Economy. Amy, thank you for being with us as well.
Pleasure.
Thanks so much. Senator, I'd like to start with you. If you could just briefly provide us a synthesis in your view of what is the number one takeaway that Canada should learn from the Meng and Michael's affair.
Thank you, Zach, and good day to all of you. Thank you to IPD for organizing the session and for having me and the other panelists. I can't give you one lesson, so I'm going to give you a few. I'm sorry for breaking the rules so early in the session, but here they come. The first is that there are extradition requests, and then there are extradition requests. And this episode with Madam Meng should be a lesson for our governments to reflect on varieties of extradition requests and how they respond to them. I won't go further than that, but I think there's a lesson to be learned there. The second is that the Chinese play hardball. They are unsentimental, they are brutal in the way they pursue what they see to be their interests. And we witnessed that in spades in the form of the detention of our two Michaels. And there are Canadian citizens detained, of course, by the two Michaels. Robert Schellenberg, to another extent, also part of the example of how the Chinese respond in draconian ways, and how we should be very conscious of this approach to international affairs that they take. I'm not sure we should go further to say that this is going to be routine practice of the Chinese government, because the Madam Meng detention was a very special type of incident that they responded to, but they pull no punches. Very clear about that. The third lesson is that this hostage episode, on the one hand, the extradition request of Madam Meng and the detention of our two compatriots, was eventually solved by political means, whatever the parties may say. It was resolved by way of a hostage exchange, however you might want to spin it, and that we could have come to this solution a lot sooner than the 1,019 or 20 days that it took to reach that solution. And for all the pious statements about how we will cleave to the rule of law and not engage in political solutions to the problem that we had, that is where we ended up. And the people who paid the price were principally the two Michaels, who had to spend a much longer time in detention than if we had responded sooner to what was the solution that was staring at us in the first place. And the final lesson is what you mentioned, and I think that's the theme of our webinar today. This is ultimately about great power competition between China and the US. Whatever the merits of the Chinese actions or the US actions, we were caught in between. We were put in a hard place, and we were taken out of a hard place by the two powers that put us in that place. And this is the first of likely many other incidents that we will have to respond to. And our big challenge will be to find what I've called the degrees of freedom that we are allowed or that we are willing to grasp in pursuing a somewhat independent Canadian foreign policy. Back to you, Zach.
Thanks so much, Senator, and we'll absolutely get into that. I'd like to go over to Amy next. Do you agree largely with the Senator's take on what should be Canada's primary takeaway from this whole episode, or do you think that the primary lessons for Canada lie perhaps elsewhere?
Some of it I would agree with some of it, but I think similarly, I think Canada needs to develop its cultural IQ and realize or better understand how China operates. And I think we're getting better at that now. Unfortunately, we had to have an experience, but we jumped in with both feet. And I think we didn't really do enough homework, and or we were optimistic or naive in thinking that they operate the way we might operate. So now we are wiser and smarter. The other thing is also understanding the power of leverage and really understanding what is our leverage. As we saw with the last American administration and with China, it was a leverage game, and so too is it today. So for example, as upset as China might be with Canada for taking Meng Wanzhou for whatever reasons, they think it's arbitrary. We followed the rule of law, but it's very interesting. I find that China didn't take any American hostages or arrest anyone from America. So we should ask ourselves, well, is that because there was too much at stake in terms of leverage? So we need to get smarter about the dynamic as well between national security, economic security, and geopolitics. We cannot separate the three. They are obviously very intertwined. And we have to get shrewder about having a comprehensive plan across the nation. We can't keep operating in silos. Federal and provincial governments have to start collaborating. And we need this one strong 5-year, 10-year, 15-year long-term plan. And sometimes I call it, maybe a little bit of industrial policy 2.0. How do we bring some of that back? Because a lot of the challenges we have are different systems. So you can you can talk about the different systems from the legal side, but there's also different systems in terms of economic development. So I'll just leave it with one more point. It's really also, I think the one lesson is we need to learn how to also compete with China. Compete with China, not just here domestically, but globally, and realize that they are a strong entity, understand their dynamics, and develop our own new playbook on how we want to compete. We still quote trade, and in fact, I think I listened to somebody earlier today saying we have, they were still our strongest trading partner throughout 2020 through the pandemic. That's a supply chain issue as well, right? That means we aren't self-sufficient. What is our self-sufficiency plan? How are we going to diversify, et cetera? But we can come back to some of these later. But that's probably a little flavor for my perspective.
For sure, lots to get into there for sure. Henri-Paul, your main takeaway. What have you been thinking about these past few days?
Thank you, Zach, and thank you for the organization of this very timely seminar. 2 takeaways for me. The first is that American foreign policy is not always in our best interest. Obviously, the United States is a close partner, and by and large, it is a good partner. But sometimes they make choices which are not in our best interest, and we just saw it plainly in this case. Their decision to pursue a case against Meng, was it warranted? I won't comment on the specifics, but the fact is, it was their decision, and it got us into trouble. So I think that that's one takeaway, and I think that has implications for our foreign policy, and we'll get into that a little later in our conversation. The second takeaway, and I may surprise you, but I will say that Canada can stand up to China. What I mean by that is that despite all the pressure that China put on us to release Meng through or outside the extradition process, we did not. Of course, we didn't win our case neither. We didn't get a quick release for the 2 Michaels, but we did not cave in to the pressure from China. So I think that this is an important takeaway as well. And finally, the last thing I would say at this point, and it touches a bit upon what Amy was saying, I think we need a China policy, but it would be even better if we had a foreign policy, period. I'll leave it at that for now.
I would agree with you very much on that one. And you raise a very interesting prospect, this notion that in the new great power competition, or this new world order, countries can simultaneously save face while at the same time effectively losing out and engaging in lose-lose scenarios. So that poses some very interesting questions for the future of our country as well. Kim, over to you for the final opening salvo. And you're on mute. Sorry, Kim.
Thanks very much, Zach, and thanks to the IPD for organizing this. Like my fellow panelists, I think that one of the key takeaways from this particular episode is the importance of making some strategic decisions. I think that one of the things that we have not seen in the last 15 years or so, really since the early part of the century, is a willingness on the part of, in particular, our government in Ottawa, to make some strategic decisions about China. And that lack of strategic decision-making has become a significant problem, it seems to me, since the rise of Xi Jinping in particular, and on the Chinese side. And in the case of the United States, the rise of Donald Trump, but more importantly in the United States, really a transformation of American politics that we are in the midst of experiencing right now. And so one of the things that I take away from the problem that we've been experiencing is essentially the importance of making some strategic decisions. The second observation I would make, however, is that I guess that I don't agree with the idea that somehow we have been caught in between the great powers here. That essentially when we think of the emergence of a rivalry between the People's Republic of China on the one hand and the United States on the other, that it's not simply being a disinterested observer of this rivalry. We are very much on one side, and we need to, it seems to me, reflect that. I think that Canadians, for example, haven't really taken on board the importance of where Canada was in the struggle between the United States on the one hand and Huawei on the other. Keep in mind, there has been a protracted war, as the Los Angeles Times correctly called it, a war on Huawei by the United States. And in that struggle, Canada wasn't a disinterested partner. And so I think that what we've got to do when we think of the future is to recognize where we are, we as a country, in this emerging geopolitical struggle. I'll pass it back to you now.
Thanks very much. And in fact, that's a perfect segue into an opening conceptual question that I'd like to throw out to some of you. Because in order to discuss how Canada can or should navigate the US-China rivalry, I think we have to discuss first the extent to which that rivalry and great power competition more broadly is actually affecting and changing the international order in which we live today. So, Senator, in your view, do you think that this is a fundamental shift of international order we're living through right now, driven specifically by great power competition, or are important pillars of the multilateral order, in which we've relied for a long time, proving elements of resilience, in fact?
Yeah, I don't think there's much question about it. The contest between the United States and the PRC, the status quo power and the challenger, let's call it that, is the defining factor in international relations and everything that springs from it for the foreseeable future. And the way in which these two dueling powers navigate their rivalry and the way in which the rest of us, Canada in particular in this case, navigate the narrow space between the dueling elephants will determine our fate and their fates as well. And so the central question for Canada is how to, whatever term you use, and the different panelists have framed it slightly differently, but whether it's identifying who we are and what our interests are, or coming up with a strategy, or being clear with the China policy, being clear with the US policy, all of those are the questions that we need to face. But the single most important defining factor is the rivalry between the US and China. And that has not gone away, of course, with Biden coming to power. For the simple reason that with all the discord between the Democrats and Republicans on every other issue, just about, China is the one issue on which they can have some agreement on, and Biden will be only too happy to lean tough on China precisely because it's a point of commonality with the other side.
Amy, I'm wondering if I could add a little bit of a trade and economics perspective on the question that I just posed to the Senator, which is, a lot of people these days are talking about decoupling from China and the reorientation of supply chains, et cetera. How much do you actually see that happening over the years ahead? Or is the gravity rule of economics still very much in play, that China is just such a large market and so deeply intertwined already into the global economy that we're actually not seeing a fundamental shift of the international economic order? Or are we?
Yeah, I think what the Western world is awakening to is that they were unfortunately a little too complacent. They became very dependent on China. You've heard to for on the supply chain side because they were super cheap, super responsive, super available. And hey, why bother if we could get the best price in a multitude of products? I mean, at a very minor scale, have you ever seen this many dollar stores in your life? Imagine if we cut off China, you couldn't buy all these, knickknacks and household goods for the low prices that you see today. So I think what this begs is more fiscal responsibility on all of our sides, not only just Canada. I mean, that's part of the alarm bells that have been ringing in America. They have been on the defense and are starting their offense strategy because free markets really didn't respond to how the new global economy has evolved with the rise of China. And in any financial advisor, or at least the good ones, will say, diversify your portfolio. And I think Canada also got caught with the fact that we did not diversify. And that's just bad business practice. It's not necessarily bad to be doing business with China, but it's a high risk, right? There's a risk reward ratio that we talk about in the commercial world, and that was just bad business. I mean, we saw that with the whole canola embargo. I mean, and the canola farmers were crying. Well, you know what? I feel their pain, but we really shouldn't have been that dependent on one customer or one trade partner. And even more critically, during the pandemic, I mean, gosh, natural resources is our key advantage. We've got trees galore. How come we don't have the capacity to make paper for masks? Tragic. I mean, it was, right? Okay, and then we refactored in some manufacturing. My point is, I think a lot of it has to do also with revisiting our economic growth plans, and how are we becoming more self-sufficient? How are we diversifying? And then incorporating geopolitical risk with all the partners that we either get supplies from or end goods from, because as we can see, it's a tool. It's an economic warfare tool, and you don't want to be caught in that situation again.
A question for Kim and Henri-Paul, which I'd like to pose to both of you, which is, what are Canada's core interests in a shifting international order, right? To what extent are Canada's core interests shaped by immutable factors such as geography, and therefore the shift in the international order doesn't necessarily change that much? Or to what extent actually are Canada's core interests informed by these shifts, and therefore that may require a reorientation of the priorities and goals even of Canadian foreign policy? Kim first, and then Henri-Paul.
Let me begin by saying that there's one thing that you can't change, and that is one's geography. But the geostrategic importance of one's geographic location will shift over time. I mean, if you think of Canada's geostrategic location at the beginning of the 20th century, for example, and compare it with our geographic location in the 1970s and 1980s, stuck as we were between two nuclear powers, or our geographic location now, our geostrategic interests are going to always be connected to the United States. And if we have a core interest, in my humble estimation, it has always been, and bluntly put, I think it will always be, that we need to ensure our good relations with the United States, good relations economically, good relations politically, good relations on the question of defense.
And if I may add, in terms of our core interests, the very basic essence of any foreign policy should be, of course, the security and the prosperity of our population. I mean, that should be the very core. And I think in the current circumstances, this great power rivalry between the US and China is not serving us all that well. And if there's one thing, at the risk of being seen old-fashioned, if there's one thing that a mid-sized country like Canada needs, it's a rules-based international order. Easier said than done, but I think that that's essential. If I may go back a little bit to the geopolitics of it all, we're going to have to cope with the fact that China will occupy a more prominent role in the world. I think it's a given. The question is, how can we best cope with that, including how can the US best cope with that? Much has been said and written lately about China's very aggressive diplomacy and coercive diplomacy. But I think we also need to look at the US foreign policy as well. And we can understand that the US wants to get tough on China. It's perfectly understandable. So there's a degree of that competition that we can understand. But I'm afraid that the US may be overdoing it in the process. And let me quote a recent article in Foreign Affairs by Richard Haas. He said the following, and I'll quote: "Competing with China is essential, but it cannot provide the organizing principle for American foreign policy in an era increasingly defined by global challenges." So I think a little recalibration may be necessary on the side of the US, and I think that neither the US nor us should lose sight of the objective prosperity and security. Competition and what we do with China is sort of the means. So I think we have to bear that in mind. And again, I come back to my initial point. The US is not always right, and sometimes they will get things wrong. We just have to think about Iraq. So I think that even though, like Kim says, I think that we know where we're located geographically, and we have to factor that in. And America will always be a very close partner. But two things. I think that there might be a need for toning down a little bit the rhetoric on the US side, and for us I like the expression that you used as you call this seminar. I think we'll have to navigate this and not simply stick on one side.
Thank you all for that, and it certainly gives us a lot of food for thought. Just want to thank our participants as well for posing their questions already in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Feel free, please, to continue posing those questions, and I will try to get to as many as possible a little later on in our seminar today. It's great to see that there's such interest in this very timely topic. My next question to Senator Wu concerns, in effect, Canada's core interest as it relates to the structure of the international order we now inhabit, because there are multiple terms that have been thrown around as we've discussed over the past several years, this transition in international order. We've heard the term rules-based international order. We've heard the term liberal international order, which is presumably more centered on liberal values. We've heard the term US primacy, which is part of the discussion in Washington a lot these days. And so I'm wondering, in your estimation, what serves Canada's core interests most? What is the most important asset to Canada's security, as it were, over the long term? Is it having a rules-based and multilateral international order? Is it having an international order that is rooted to the extent possible in liberal values, because that allows liberal democracies like Canada the ability to set the terms on a global stage? It gives Canada more of a, if not a tool, at least a buffer, as it were, of defense, making the world safe for liberal democracies, as it were. Or is it US primacy? Should we just be honest that US primacy, given our geographic location, that the preservation of US primacy is the most important Canadian strategic goal, in your estimation?
Wow, that's a big question. And if you will allow me just to respond a bit to a previous comment about the kind of a revisionist history of how China got to where it is in its economic relations with the West. There's a story which seems to portray the West as the unwitting dupes of China inveigling itself into Western economic systems and making us captive to Chinese goods and services, these cheap goods and services and so on and so forth. That's a gross misrepresentation of the story. We were willing partners in all of this. And not only that, we prospered on the backs of cheap Chinese labor. The Chinese exploited themselves for 40 years, producing these cheap trinkets for the West, earning cents on the larger amounts of royalties and benefits that the owners of the patents the Western companies had by subcontracting and contracting out the production of these goods to China. And we were very happy for that to take place because it gave us an era of low inflation, high productivity growth, and increasing standards of living for some people, not all people. And that's, of course, the present discontent we have here today. But my point really is this. It is a misrepresentation and a very dangerous assertion to somehow suggest that China tricked us into this world we are in now. The reason why we had this economic conflict is not because China is producing cheap goods. It's because they want to produce not cheap goods. It's because they want to produce high-tech goods. It's because they actually want to compete where the money is. That's the reason for the geostrategic conflict when it comes to economics. And if we fail to see that, I think we fail to understand a very fundamental aspiration of the Chinese people, which is precisely to break out of the 40-year trap of producing cheap stuff at very low wages. So just a bit of a commentary there as context for how we think about the future. In terms of the global context, well, the first thing to say is that a rules-based order is not the same as a liberal democratic order. You can have a rules-based system, which is very illiberal. And I think one has to acknowledge that the rules-based system we have today, which is the legacy of the post-war period, the Bretton Woods institutions and everything that came out of the people who won the Second World War, is not necessarily the system that benefits all countries. It's not necessarily the liberal, however you define it, but even under a generous definition, it's not necessarily a system that benefits certain groups of people, particularly those who were not part of the victorious combatants in the Second World War. And that, of course, is the gist of the challenge, not just that China is making to the international system, but the other emerging powers as well, what they used to call the BRICS. There is a desire to revisit not just the rules, but also the governance of international institutions. These are debates that continue today. And Canada, I think, benefits from a rules-based system that is generally liberal and democratic and internationalist. But we have to be open to the fact that the rules we have today and the governance of the institutions that manage the rules are not necessarily in the interests of the larger international community. And we have to be part of the reform process that updates, protects, and advances a truly rules-based system that helps, first of all, small countries, small and medium-sized countries like Canada, but which also allow the emerging powers to have a say in the way the world runs.
If you don't mind me asking a follow-up as well, based on something that Kim mentioned earlier about the fact that the U.S. is always going to remain the center of our geostrategic focus. There are two key things to a certain extent that Canada has to do on this particular topic right now. One is to have a discussion about China and the extent to which we may have to erect some fences here and there and revisit the fundamentals of our relationship with Beijing. The other is, how do we deal with the United States? How do we deal with the US, which is increasingly unilateralist and dedicated to advancing its own interests in the context of a great power competition that don't necessarily align with ours? What do you think is actually a more important and fundamental priority for Canada, in fact? Which poses bigger risks? Is it the risk of Chinese interference because we haven't put up enough fences, or is it actually the destabilizing risk of a shifting US foreign policy that is rooted in global shifts in the balance of power, but also very profound shifts in American society itself and American politics?
Look, I'll be brief. I want the other panelists to come in on this, but to the extent that we're talking about a triangular relationship, it's not an equilateral triangle, where all sides are the same. It's not even an isosceles triangle where we are the short end and the other two parties are equal in length. It's what they call a scalene triangle. Those of you who remember your geometry from high school days. And a scalene triangle is where the three lengths are different. We are the shortest length for sure. And the US is the longest length, and it will always be the case for us. But the challenge for Canadian foreign policy is to try and make scalene a little more isosceles, if I can put it that way. It will never be isosceles. But I think the goal, as I said earlier, is to find the degrees of freedom which we can either grasp or extract or claim so that we can have a little bit more of objectivity and balance to pursue our interests. Let me quote David Jacobson, no less. You saw in his Globe and Mail article today, which is very sensible. He talked about, working together on supply chains, particularly on rare earths and natural resources in North America, all perfectly sensible. But he quoted Palmerston. And what did he quote? That famous quote about how there are no permanent allies, there are only permanent interests. Bingo, bingo. We should follow David Jacobson's advice.
Kim,
if I may jump in,
okay. Please.
I really like, first of all, the senator's comparison with the triangle, and then the point about allies and interests, because I was going to say in this triangle, we have to remember, from a Canadian perspective, we have to remember the core tenet of foreign policy. In international relations, there are no friends, only interests. And I would like to add also values, but that should be the core of our thinking. I think the first thing we have to define is what are our core interests, and we haven't done that for years. Hence the call for foreign policy.
Thanks very much. We've got a question from the audience directed by Mark Horvath to Professor Nossel. So let's go over to you. What are the most important strategic decisions in your view that Canada has to take on China right now? Can you provide some examples? And I'd like to throw out just a second question to you as well, concerning the discussion that has just been launched. Where does it make sense for Canada to draw the line vis-a-vis the US when it comes to our own core interests, right? When should we be falling in line behind them in the context of the great power competition that has been launched? And at what point do we really have to draw a red line and say, no, actually, this is where our interests fundamentally diverge from yours?
Well, let me begin with the first question, and the response essentially has to be from the perspective of the government in Ottawa, to essentially begin to change the nature of our relationship with the People's Republic of China, in particular with the Central People's Government in Beijing. In a sense, what we've done over the last decade or so is pursue a China policy that has not fully recognized some of the profound changes that have occurred in the strategic aspect of Chinese foreign policy, and we've seen that accelerate under President Xi over the last 6 or 7 years. And so that when it comes to looking at what Canada needs to do, yes, we need the articulated foreign policy. Yes, we need to think strategically, but we also need to recognize, as Senator Wu has said, that we're dealing with an actor that knows what it wants and has no hesitation at all about acting in its own interests. And so that from that point of view, we need to, in a sense, have the scales fall from our eyes a little bit, and to pursue a much more realistic, if not realpolitik, approach to the People's Republic of China. The second question, and of course it's absolutely related, is how do we deal with the United States the changes that we see in Washington and in American society. And one of the things that we haven't talked about so far today is what the implications for the next several years are going to be for Canadians, of the fact that the United States' politics is growing increasingly dysfunctional, and the fact that it is entirely possible that we are going to see the return of a Trumpist, or indeed perhaps even Mr. Trump himself, as president in 2024. This is going to provide Canadians with a profound set of problems in our relations, not only with the People's Republic of China, but with the government in Washington as well.
Amy, can I go over to you, and based on your expertise, if you could provide an estimation of where the US-China rivalry is going over the next 5 to 10 years, including in the economic and technological sector, and based on that estimation, what do you think if the trend continues, what will be the fundamental consequences, for Canada that we have to prepare for? And you're muted, Amy.
Yeah, I was just saying, great question. And I think, just to step back from picking on America and, how their politics have changed. And I want us to step back and understand why. They are sounding the alarm bells, and we need to open up our ears as to why this is happening. Now, I'm not saying everything they're doing is the right way to go, but what is the stimulus? The stimulus or the catalyst for this response to China is ultimately economic security, which is related to national security. And economic security because America, Canada, UK, and some other countries fell asleep at the wheel as China was growing and building. And as Senator Wu was, highlighting to us, they weren't just creating cheap goods to make cents on the dollar. They were looking to build their intelligence and their capacity and their ability to compete with us. They were busy learning, but we were not busy learning, and we still aren't getting busy learning. Okay, so innovation, we've kind of stayed stagnant at innovation. Again, generally speaking, before everybody sends me emails afterwards and highlighting how innovative we are, generally speaking, right? We've been the best. Let's just say Canada and the US are known to be innovative, especially US, Silicon Valley, et cetera. And natural progression is what happens is, others are trying to get better. And China has been working really hard at getting better. And that's why they, in their Made in China 2025 plan, they've highlighted at least 10 key industries, and they want to be leaders, et cetera. And, the recent actions by the American government on silicon chips, et cetera, has just fueled their desire and their fire more. Okay, so let's get back to the why. So we have not been really tracking this, right? We were a little bit, I kind of take a look and you're like, it's okay, they'll never get there. We underestimated what would happen, how they would grow. And so America is trying to catch up. America is trying to compete now, which is fantastic. I've been talking about this stuff for 5 years. We need to learn how to compete with China. Let's learn how they do business so we can, appropriately counter them. And I started doing this in a program when I worked at Cisco in California 15 years ago, and how to compete with Huawei when they were still growing. Okay, and understanding they use geopolitics to influence business outcomes, not like us. It's not just about technical parity, et cetera. Okay, so again, put that to the side. So that's the catalyst. And the UK is waking up to this as well. They invited me to provide testimony to the UK Parliament session on 5G infrastructure. It's called something longer, but essentially they're like, okay, since we followed the Americans' charge to ban Huawei. And by the way, it wasn't only for national security reasons, but for supply chain challenges. They're like, even if they didn't agree with all of the national security issues that US was posing, the actions by America, these aggressive actions, were going to jeopardize potential, the sustainability of having a Huawei solution. So they said, Amy, well, we're finally taking a look at this. Please tell us, right? You've been talking about this for a while. We see now, how do we catch up? So the UK is looking at this, again, in the context of 5G infrastructure telecom. I said, look, why don't you, Canada or the US, have a player in 5G infrastructure? Why have you allowed there to be only 3 main players, of which Huawei is tied with Ericsson in first place, right? Why has your academics and your really smart people in all the universities in the UK, in Canada, and other places, why have you just been doing the R&D and giving it to Huawei and not thinking, oh, maybe we could commercialize this? How come we don't have a company? And don't get me on the path about whining that, oh, Nortel died because China stole their IP. Well, you know what? Create a new Nortel. Or why didn't the government continue fueling Nortel, recognizing that it was a strategic advantage in the long run? Because we don't have a long-term plan. We don't have, anyways, my rant is, I'm not trying to take sides. All I'm saying is we need to understand the why. Simon Sinek talks about it, but we really have to look at the motivation. And what is the motivation of the Chinese? Okay, they are still trying to recover from the age of humiliation or whatever that, however they, quote it, right? But it's emotional, right? There's some emotion that they want to take their power back. And that's a little bit why. So once we understand where it's coming from, then I think Canada can be a little bit more informed as to how they want to play, because Canada's the last in this triangle, right? Canada, UK, and US, say, ally system. We're still la-di-dying and taking walks in the Gatineau Hills in the forest and smelling the trees and wondering why everybody's being so aggressive. Well, there's reasons. And we have to identify if we should be as worried for the same reasons, and how do we start playing and catching up as well. Thank you for letting me go off on that tangent.
For sure, Amy. And it's interesting. We've seen basically 2 different, simultaneously realist or realpolitik-based perspectives that have been put forward on this panel so far. One which argues that a realist approach towards China means getting a little bit tougher on China and balancing against China. And another one that says basically realpolitik means finding a way to navigate these different powers at the same time. And we see this debate playing out in Washington as well, where realists indeed disagree on the need whether or not to, deal effectively with, the Chinese issue en masse, with a massive rebalancing, as it were, towards the Pacific, or rather, a different perspective of realism, which emphasizes restraint. So that's quite an interesting dichotomy, that even, a more realistic approach doesn't necessarily provide us with all of the answers that we seek, which leads me into my next question for Senator Wu, concerning seeing as there are these different approaches to constructing an order with or against China. Where are we at this point on that front? Is it possible still at this point, based on how far relations have deteriorated between China and the West, to imagine some sort of international order? You want to call it a rules-based international order, that's fine, that relies on order building with China rather than treating China fundamentally as a threat to balance against? Is there still a middle ground at this point where that can be reached, or are we too far past at this point?
The international order question is too big for my head to wrap around. So I'll just talk about Canada, the US, and China. What I would say is that the US is going too far. I have no doubt about that. And Canada has always been a good friend to the US when our American cousins have gone too far in trying to help them come back to the golden mean. And this is that time. This is that time in history when we have to recognize not just that we should pursue a slightly different approach because it's in our interests, but because it's good for the world. Look, we have an incoming American ambassador to Canada if he's confirmed in all of that, who has described China as an existential threat. You couldn't come closer to a declaration of war. If the Americans genuinely believe that China is an existential threat, we have to say to the Americans, we do not agree with that. And that's why I support Minister Garneau's 4 Cs, I think he calls it, in the response to China post-Meng. And the first of the Cs is coexist. And we have to continually emphasize that coexistence has to be a starting point in our conception of China vis-a-vis Canada, vis-a-vis the United States, and vis-a-vis the international order. And everything will flow from that. But if we don't even have that starting point, for sure, we're headed towards a very ugly situation.
A follow-up for you. We have a question from the audience from Nancy Nightingale from Further Capital Partners. And the question concerns values. Yes, we have these permanent interests. Yes, there is a need to communicate very clearly to the United States that we don't see the China issue the same way that they do. But nonetheless, does the greater similarity of values between Canada and the United States not, to a certain extent, should that not also be an important source that guides our foreign policy, if not an even more important source than questions of realpolitik and simply knowing what your interests are?
This is the old debate of values versus interests. We're not going to solve it today. I lean in the direction of interests, but I believe that we have to implement our values where we have the power to implement them. And that means on all issues that are domestically oriented within our borders, whether it's Chinese companies operating here or Chinese students or Chinese nationals or whatever it might be, we not only have the right, but the responsibility and the obligation to be true to our values by enforcing laws and regulations and practices that cleave to our values. But it's a whole different question to try and implement our version of values on what's happening well outside of Canadian borders. And that is where we need to inject some sense of realism into whether our efforts to try and change behavior, whether it's the Chinese or the Saudis or the Turks or the Americans for that matter, will have any impact. And that's where a greater sense of realpolitik, I think, has to come into play.
This leads me into a good follow-up for Henri Paul. Yes, feel free to weigh in. And I just want to throw in an additional question on top to what you plan to say, which is, we talk about the need to cooperate with like-minded countries as a means of increasing our international clout on questions like this. And the senator has been highlighting the extent to which the United States, in fact, is not necessarily a like-minded country as it relates to the China threat. We don't perceive China the same way. So if there's us and there's, let's say, the European Union and a few other assorted countries in the Asia-Pacific region that don't want to choose between the United States and China, I'm not saying that that's our position, but I'm saying, if we're looking for like-minded countries out there, are there enough like-minded countries out there that are influential and powerful enough for us actually to be able to make a difference on this question of the Sino-American rivalry going forward?
Okay, a couple of observations. First of all, values have to be part of our foreign policy, including vis-a-vis China. And in Canada, as the senator says, but I think that internationally as well. And I would strongly argue that we have to speak out on human rights issues around the world, including in China. And it may hurt our interests at times, fair enough. But this has to be part of our foreign policy. We cannot simply remain silent when things like what's happening currently in Xinjiang is happening. We have to speak out. This being said, we also have to be conscious that the impact on the ground of what we can do, is I'll use the word modest, okay? We cannot really force China or many other countries for that matter, just to change because we say so. So we have to be conscious, I think, of our relatively modest impact. But even if we only have a modest impact, we have to try to get that impact. And even if we don't have any impact, we still have to speak on issues that appeal to our conscience. So I would want to be very, very clear about that. And to your question, Zach, are there other countries out there, enough countries willing to do this? I would like to think so. Not that it is easy to garner the support of other countries and to speak with one voice, but there are precedents. Even just a few months ago at the Human Rights Council, I mean, some countries, including Canada, of course, spoke out on China, even though it's sensitive. So it has to be part of our foreign policy.
Gotcha. Thanks very much. Question that is related to this, I guess, over to Kim, related to Canada's what you call its North Atlantic anchor, the fact that it has had a foreign policy that has for decades been oriented towards the Euro-Atlantic region. And that seems to be the case as well today, and explains to a large, not exclusively, but to a large extent why Canada was not included, for example, in the recent AUKUS agreement between the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom. So I'm wondering if in your view, this long-standing strategy that Canada has had to be focused more on NATO and not really on the Pacific theater, is that something that needs to be updated? Does Canada really have to abandon effectively 7 decades of its foreign policy tradition to orient itself towards these new challenges and a new world centered on Sino-American competition? Or rather, are there actually benefits to Canada maintaining that North Atlantic pillar by basically saying to the United States, look, here's where we can be useful to you, and it's in the Euro-Atlantic theater, adopting, NATO's, goals and advancing NATO's Atlanticist goals. And maintaining that pillar therefore allows Canada to have a win-win situation as well in the Pacific, in which Canada can therefore say, we're a happy-go-lucky, trade-centric, positive-sum type country in the Pacific that is not involved in sort of military and the security dimension of the Pacific theater.
Well, let me begin first with a comment on the new security pact in the Pacific between the United States and Australia and the United Kingdom. We in Canada have tended to take the view that we were excluded from this, and this basically is just not the case at all. AUKUS was a very particular arrangement between the Australians on the one hand and the Brits and the Americans on the other. And it just as other allies of the United States in the Pacific, notably Japan and Korea and New Zealand, are not part of AUKUS. So too, I don't think Canadians should think about having been excluded. On the other hand, there's no doubt that our transatlantic focus has led us to be relatively irrelevant in the Asia Pacific. And bluntly put, it seems to me that one can absolutely understand it, given the fact that Canadians hate to spend their tax dollars on international affairs, despite the mythology that governments in Ottawa like to create around this. We, generally speaking, spend as little as we can get away with. And in the Asia Pacific, or the Indo-Pacific, as it is increasingly being called, we have spent very little. And so that it seems to me that one of the things that we need to recognize, and one of the strategic decisions we need to take, is to decide whether or not we're going to step up to the plate when it comes to spending. And it's not only spending on defense, but it's also spending on other aspects of international affairs. Now, we can choose essentially to be as cheap as we have these last 70 years on spending across the Pacific, but then, essentially we forfeit any position to have a say in how the Asia Pacific evolves. And it seems to me that as other participants in the panel have suggested, what we seriously need is to be the voice of moderation. And it's no point in trying to be the voice of moderation to the other side of the triangle. The only voice of moderation that makes any sense for us is in Washington. And it seems to me that what we need to do is to pay particular attention to how it is that we can be listened to in Washington. And at present, I have to say that we are so irrelevant when it comes to the geopolitics of the Asia Pacific. And the only way around that is to make some strategic decisions about whether we want to continue that, it seems to me, in the 2020s.
We've got half an hour left, and we've got a few angles we'd still like to explore on this topic. So please, to all of our audience, stick with us, and we'll try to get to as many audience questions as we can. I've got a couple of questions I'd like to pose to Amy before going back to Senator Wu. Amy, first of all, based on the USMCA trade agreement agreed between Canada and the United States, I guess it was towards the tail end of 2018, if I can recall correctly, which appeared to restrict Canada's ability to sign, a free trade agreement with a country like China. And it's, I think it's fair to say that it's, as much as there are other economic opportunities elsewhere in the world, it's difficult to imagine Canada diversifying its trading partners, or its trade in general, excuse me, without relying on deeper trade with China to some extent. So I'm wondering if you could weigh in on what Canada's trade and trade diversification strategy should be in the wake of the USMCA, whether there's any sort of wiggle room there. And my second question to you, Amy, concerns the recent application of China to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. Is this something that Canada should welcome? I mean, is there any prospect, of course, of China joining in the first place because of the rules and standards of the CPTPP? Or actually, is China capable of fudging, to the extent necessary that it would, lay the groundwork for China effectively to be admitted? And if that's the case, should this be something that Canada should welcome?
Interesting. Yeah, those are both very juicy topics. Let me see if I can break it down in short form. Basically you're saying, should Canada grease the way for China to get a yes at the CPTPP? I would pose the question back: does China even want Canada to? Nobody's actually brought up the question, or I'd like to get an explanation about China's foreign affairs minister, who said on Monday, after the release of all three M's, I hope that Canada has learned its lesson. Now, I don't know the context. I don't know what was around it, but we need to understand first and foremost, how are we now with China? How does China perceive us? China, I think, generally has a lot. We could have a stronger relationship. I don't think they have a lot of respect for Canada at this point. There has to be some some relationship building, or at least reconnaissance. Like, let's find out where we are at. Are we still friends, or are we playing in tangential groups? Right, like back to high school days. Whose clique are we in? So that's the first aspect is, and I don't even think it's our role to open those kind of doors for China and the CPTPP. And I think the other members are going to have a lot of strong views as to whether they want them to participate or not as well. And I think the other contingency is the USA, right? They've been in dialogues. I know that President Trump pulled the USA out, during his administration. I think they're looking at still participating in some capacity or becoming stronger on that. And I think, unfortunately or fortunately, I think it's just the way of the world is. I loved Senator Wu's triangle visual, right? And if we have to pick sides, right, the U.S. has a stronger weight. You referenced the USMCA agreement. Now, and the 2018, and I smiled when you mentioned it, because I think that's really important. Because the arrest happened a month later, maybe after things exploded with between US and Canada, while Canada was trying to go it alone. So there's been a lot of dialogue about Canada's independent and should make up its own mind and make up its own trade agreements. And well, it's not that easy. First of all, Canada's not that strong on its own. I think we were a little bit, I don't know, what's another word for delusional? I think we misunderstood what our strength and independence is and was on the global scale. I think we still are in the fantasy that the G7 rules the world and we are one of the 7. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Okay, so the big blow up happened when, Canada was trying to be best friends with both China and with USA, and they were trying to negotiate a free trade agreement with China. And that's when the USA put that clause in the USMCA saying, hey, pick your friends wisely, because if you're friends with our non-friend, I'm not going to say enemy, right? But our lesser friend, then I'm not sure that I can come over and play as much in your backyard, because I don't trust what might be in your backyard based on some of the friends that you welcome in. Okay, so citing national security, et cetera. So I think we do have to make those strong choices in the near term until, or unless, or if we define what our leverage is and how strong we are we on our own, which I don't think many nations can survive in this global economy today without having that strong relationship with the allies. And you brought up AUKUS, and indeed, we probably didn't have a really strong play there. But when you go back to the Five Eyes collaboration and the intelligence sharing and everything, the USA is stating their rules for engagement very clearly, okay? And we have to make some really tough decisions today as to what the repercussions are of not playing by other allies' rules, what the trade-offs are, and can we sustain ourselves without that? But before you close and say, oh, she's picking the USA, we don't even know that China wants to be our best friend anymore. So I think we need to figure out what is possible in terms of that relationship and where we're at, and recalibrate.
That's a very good segue actually into a question we have from the audience. You raised this prospect that it is basically going to be impossible to get along with both the United States and China at the same time in this emerging global context. But there's a question for Senator Wu from Peter Huang, who is a Canadian student at Johns Hopkins University. And he asks if there are any lessons that Canada can learn from Singapore and its ability to navigate a complex geography that normally should impose limitations on its foreign policy options. It seems to be doing relatively well, not choosing between one side or the other. Is there anything that's relevant there in terms of lessons for Canada that we could put into practice, or are the geographic contexts just too different?
Perhaps Peter knows that I'm originally from Singapore, so I have some knowledge of my old stomping grounds, and the conventional wisdom is that Singapore knows how to play the game. It's probably more true during the Lee Kuan Yew days than it is under BG, well, Goh Chok Tong and BG Lee. In fact, recent experience suggests that Singapore is not doing quite as well in its balancing act. It's incurred the displeasure of China on a number of issues, including sending military equipment through Hong Kong en route back from Taiwan. But I mean, the context is just so different, and it's really not possible for Canada to take lessons for Singapore, except maybe insofar as having the scales fall from the eyes, and to recognize that the two superpowers act in their interests. History plays a big role in decision-making and understanding history, the history of American presence in the Pacific theater, the history of China's much longer presence throughout East and Southeast Asia is a big factor in understanding foreign policy. And being willing to provide that element of constructive ambiguity in foreign policy. Singaporeans are very good at that. Canada much less so, partly because of democracy. We feel we need to say what we think, or say what we think the people want us to think, and that makes it much more awkward for our foreign policy maneuvering. But the short answer to the question is that Singapore is a whole different world that provides limited lessons for Canada.
Understood. Thanks so much. We've got 20 minutes left, and we've got a whole bunch of audience questions. I just want to tell our audience as well that if we don't get to your question, feel free, please, to email it to info@peacediplomacy.org. We'll forward it on to the panelists, and hopefully they'll be able to get back to you. Many of the questions posed, touch on one angle or another of some of the topics we've already touched on today, and it's just shows just how complex and multifaceted this topic is, and how exactly we're supposed to address this topic and what order logically does it proceed is such a complex endeavor. So thank you all for being with us for this. In the final 20 minutes, though, what I do want to make sure that we do is that we leave our audience with some clear takeaways on how to move forward. So I'm going to go around the horn to all four of you, and I'm going to ask two pointed questions. The first question is, and this comes from Wenran Jiang in the audience, who's a member of our advisory board. He asks, what does Canada have to do right now? Name the top thing or two things or three things to reset its relationship with China one way or the other, whether it's a reset in terms of relaunching and getting things on the right track again, sort of a US-Russia type reset of the Obama Clinton times, as it were, or rather reset as in erecting new fences and adopting a new approach. Take it in whichever direction you want, and I'll throw in on top of that, what are the top 1, 2, 3 things that Canada has to do right now in order to reset its relationship with the United States as well? So yeah, Canada-China and Canada-US, what do we have to do right now? Starting with Kim.
Both tough questions. Let me take the relationship with the United States first. It seems to me that what we need to do to reset our relationship with the United States is paradoxically to reset our relationship with the People's Republic of China. And what that means is essentially to act out what Minister Garneau began to elaborate. But that also means to stop talking about the notion that somehow, miraculously, we can turn the clock back and pretend that the last 5 years or more hasn't happened. It seems to me that what we need to do is, yes, indeed, as Senator Wu puts it, to have the scales fall from our eyes, not as a matter of choosing between the United States and China, because there's no choice to be made, but rather what we do need to do is to reflect on the fact that what the Chinese did to Canada, regardless of what the Canadians did to China as far as Huawei is concerned, is not exactly the kind of basis for the reestablishment of the kind of warm relationship that Canadian governments in the first part of this century sought. So what we've got to do, it seems to me, is to approach the government in Beijing with a much tougher and much harder request to essentially put the relationship onto a more realistic basis. And it seems to me that is part of the reset of the relationship with the Biden administration. And in that respect, what we're going to have to do is to make some strategic decisions. In particular, we're going to have to make some strategic decisions about defense policy. Part of the China challenge has to do with defense. And the Liberal government since 2015 has essentially been playing games with a lot of key defense decisions. And that, it seems to me, is going to have to come to an end if we want to reset our relationship with Washington, and to be able to be taken seriously by the Americans when it comes to these geostrategic elements.
Henri-Paul, over to you.
I think there are two things that we need to do in the next few months. But before I get to these two things, let me make a long introduction, picking up on Kim's point that we cannot pretend that the last 5 years did not happen. You know, the good old days, and many of us have taken part in this, the good old days where, you know, Canadians and Chinese would sit down around a banquet and remember, you know, the rich history of Canada-China friendship, you know, from Norman Bethune to the wheat shipments in the 60s, to the fact that we were early in establishing diplomatic relations with China. And then, you know, going around with a glass of Mao Tai and saying, you know, wei zhongjia de you yi, wan wan cui, ganbei. You know, these years are over. This being said, we will have to reestablish a useful relation with China. I'll use the word useful. It's in the interest of both countries, and we can have a fuller conversation on that, on what should that relationship be. But to get back to your specific question, what are the two, let's say, two things that I think we have to do in the next few months? First of all is think. What do we want in our relationship with China? What are our objectives, our interests? Let's think this through in a meaningful foreign policy sense. So that will require a little bit of time. Secondly, to reestablish this contact with China, an option I throw out on the table. Maybe in due course, Canada should appoint some, you know, special envoy or representative, or call him or her the way you want it. And hopefully China would do the same to establish, to try to reestablish a dialogue. Of course, we have our ambassadors, and I have all respect in the world for ambassadors, of course, but there might be a need for something fresh here. And you know how important personal relationships are with in China. So maybe, you know, maybe appointing a special envoy of sort who, you know, would speak truth, but who would, you know, personally represent the Prime Minister and the Canadian government. Maybe that would be a way to go to try to reestablish a useful dialogue and a useful relationship. You know, just by closing, you know, there was a time when we had some dialogues with China, the strategic dialogue, the human rights dialogue. I used to be part of this human rights dialogue. We need to reestablish some kind of dialogue with China, and maybe a special envoy of sorts may be one way to do it once we've thought through what it is that we want, because the Chinese know what they want. I'm not sure we really know what we want.
Got it. Amy, 2 minutes, please, if you don't mind. And you're on mute, Amy.
I agree with the previous two suggestions for the most part. We need to take a hard line. You know, I think Senator Wu called it hardball earlier. And I think, yeah, we need to get really serious about it. I think you get a piece of paper out, figure out what do we need for the relationship? Like what do we need to get from the relationship with China? How do we diversify some of those dependencies? And you just make it a very official exchange at a minor level, and also see what does the US need from us to fortify that alliance. We're seeing more and more we need them, whether it's for defense, whether it's for economic growth. And even if we do not agree with a lot of their tactics or force, we need to make some hard decisions about whether they might be good for us in a more macro view. I'll just leave it at that. That's probably 2 minutes.
Thank you. Senator, over to you.
Yeah, with the US, a simple message is that we don't believe in the existential threat that they perceive China to be. We believe in coexistence, and we will pursue a policy on China yet to be determined, but which is based on coexistence rather than elimination of the threat. So we want the triangle, whether it's scalene or isosceles. We don't want a straight line. On China, you know, a lot of people are clamoring for the articulation of a China policy now that the 3M issue is resolved. Strangely, I'm not that enthusiastic because I feel that the fever on China has not broken. I've described, the mood in Ottawa on China as febrile. It's been febrile for 3 or 4 years. And to use the COVID analogy, while we may have gotten rid of the Alpha variant, the only thing that's happened after the release of Tu Michaels and Meng is that we've got a Delta variant with us now, and it could be more virulent. Which is why I think, in a sense, the most important thing we need to do on China policy is right here at home in Canada. And it is to change the narrative on China among the media, the intelligentsia, the chattering classes, academics, people like you and me, the public. The discourse on China in this country increasingly is essentially about the illegitimacy of the Chinese government. You can see that running through all the commentary on Canada-China relations. In effect, what some people are trying to say is that any dealings with a Chinese entity, organization, institution, or person who is connected to the CCP should be deemed illegitimate, dangerous, treacherous, subversive, etc., etc. If we hold that view, if we really believe in that view, we're essentially decoupling from China because it's a Leninist state. I'm not defending the Leninist state. I'm saying that the Communist Party is supreme over all of China. The stars in China, the big star, that's the Leninists, that's the party. We have to change our view on this because we cannot have any policy with China that treats the Chinese government as illegitimate. Yes, we can express our disagreement with them. We can tell them what our values are, tell them what we think is going wrong in Xinjiang because we made the same mistakes, for example. But if we continue down the path where our national security agencies, where our universities, where our private sector companies essentially stay away from China because somehow the Chinese entity or the individual or the immigrant is connected to the state, basically we no longer have a China policy of any sort.
Thank you, Senator. I'm going to go around the horn just one more time in the same order. And what we like to do at IPD is to connect these specific questions on specific topics to broader questions related to Canadian foreign policy and grand strategy. And that's what I'd like to leave our audience with today, beginning with Kim. Based on current trends in the US-China rivalry and how Canada is responding to those trends, what will our international profile be like in 5 or 10 years' time? Are we going to be an even weaker country in terms of our influence in security matters, in global governance and international institutions, et cetera? Will it be even less likely, for example, that Canada will be able to win a seat on the UN Security Council? And if that is the case, if that is the current trend, what does Canada have to do now? And what does Canada have to do in the years ahead in order to militate against that trend? Question to Kim, and then we'll go around the horn again one more time. 90 seconds if possible.
Well, if it's going to be 90 seconds, let me fall back on history and basically say that I think that the history of Canada will speak for itself. We very much tend away from that kind of international activism. And even during the so-called golden age of Canadian diplomacy, essentially Canadians understand where we are geographically, geostrategically. And so from that point of view, it seems to me that that what we are likelier to do is to retreat back into a kind of a North American isolationism. That's my sense of what will happen in the 2020s. Let me leave it there.
A very pessimistic but sobering thought. Henri Paul, do you agree?
I think your question is worth a seminar in itself. I would hope, I don't know if Kim was advocating for this position or just predicting this is going to happen, but I would hope that we will still remain or be a leader in terms of multilateralism one way or another. By the way, there's Jocelyn Coulon, who's also on the board of IPD, just wrote a book, the title of which is À la recherche d'une identité. We've lost our identity, Canada. We have to rebuild it. So I will not try to attempt to define what it should be now, but I would hope that in terms of multilateralism, Canada is still there. even though I was involved in one of those two Security Council bids that did not succeed. And my last wish is that I hope we're going to take some initiatives. There was a time when Canada was taking initiative after initiative after initiative on the world stage. Just to mention one, the landmines treaty, just as an example. Or in case of China, we were one of the early ones to establish diplomatic relations with China. It's time to take initiatives.
Amy, to you.
I think Canada. Sorry, is the question what they will do or what I think they should do? It's what they.
I mean,
where do they fall?
The question was what should we do, but feel free to offer your prediction as well.
I think we need to reconcile values versus relations, right? We are very strong on what our values are, but I feel like we tend to pick and choose. I feel also that that economics should be a key priority in our decision-making order in terms of how we filter through. And I think that will help us figure out where we play on the multilateral trade scene.
Thanks very much for your succinct response. And Senator Wu, the last words go to you.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Nossel's scenario is very plausible and maybe even probable, but I like the word you use, Zach, which is how do we militate against these trends? And I hope we militate against that scenario, and that we do so, I think, first and foremost, by having a prosperous, successful country. And I felt for a long time that the domestic economic agenda has been lacking for many years. Of course, we're just going through COVID, and when we come out, this whole new environment, we may have an opportunity to reboot not our foreign policy, but to reboot our economic policy so that we can have the kind of productivity growth and sustainable economic performance that makes us admired around the world. That in turn surely will translate into a more credible position on the international stage.
Thank you. Just some concluding thoughts from on my end over here, which is, first of all, just so great to see a wonderful turnout today and so many questions. It shows just how passionate and interested people are in this very timely topic, and how indeed multifaceted again it is. And I think we've covered a lot, and there's so much more still to cover, going forward. But thank you all for your interest. Please do forward your questions to info@peacediplomacy.org. Second of all is that you four panelists today have expressed a number of different perspectives on these issues. And I think we've seen firsthand over recent weeks, recent months, and recent years, just how uncivil this debate in particular can be in Canada. And there are people on this panel in particular who have experienced that personally. And it speaks, I think, to the value of the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy that all four of you have been able to join us and to express divergent perspectives on this complex topic in a very civil manner. And I hope that our audience has learned a great deal from today's discussion. Today's panel discussion has brought together multiple themes from the different programs that IPD runs, including the Asia program, the Canada and the World program with which I'm affiliated, and the International Systems 2050 program, which evaluates the future shape of the international order over the 3 decades to come. There's a lot of exciting and interesting work that we're going to be putting forward in the weeks and months ahead, including the China Strategy Project that I mentioned at the outset of our panel. So please do check out our work at peacediplomacy.org. And I hope you'll join us again for future events and panels and discussions just like this one. Thank you so much for joining us. Merci beaucoup. 谢谢.
Thank you, Zach.
Thank you
so much. Au revoir.